Hey everyone, it's Chris Carter here of the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host here. We're doing an emergency episode. We do apologize for the lack of audio quality. I'm on the road here in Charlottesville, Virginia, getting ready to cover Pitt versus Virginia tomorrow as I record this. And we've had some audio problems. But we want to talk about the breaking news for the Steelers, and that's that they have released three players that we were pretty sure they would cut. That includes Mitch Trubisky at quarterback, Chuks Okorafor at offensive tackle, and Pressley Harvin at punter. Now, we all knew this was all coming down the line. Mitch Trubisky's poor play at quarterback was kind of the precedent for all of this. The Steelers were going to need to sign or draft a combination of two quarterbacks somehow to add to their roster behind Kenny Pickett or even ahead of Kenny Pickett, depending on how that goes at quarterback. Chuks Okorafor was a guy who signed for, I think, $13 million as a cap hit this year. You could not afford to pay that to a guy who was benched and consistently a backup for the final 10 games of the season. That was never going to be sustainable. And then Pressley Harvin, who they had given 3 years to figure out if he was going to be a punter. He didn't figure it out. You had to let him go. Those three moves already clear of $20 million in cap space for the Steelers, which gets them under the cap for this upcoming season, which we said was not going to be a challenge. They could still let go of Allen Robinson and add another $10 to $11 million there, and then they could still do lots of restructures, release other players. They have plenty of ways to create space and money. But these moves now signal that, okay, the front office is ready to take steps forward. They can't, of course, sign anybody until free agency begins, but it will be interesting to see who else that they add to the chopping block here, because these were the obvious ones. Chuks Okorafor wasn't coming back, neither was Mitch Trubisky, and Pressley Harvin, even though he was on a rookie deal, it makes sense to just cut bait there and start over at punter with how bad he's been at that position. But now is going to be becoming the question, what comes next as far as the cuts or creating cap space for free agency to work? Because that's the challenge right now for Omar Khan and Andy Weidl. Andy Weidl's going to be figuring out the talent they want to add to the roster. Omar Khan's got to figure out how they create the space and the money to add that talent. And that includes free agency, where I do think they're going to have to make a splash somewhere, not a huge $20 million a year splash, but probably a $10 to $15 million a year type of player, whether a defensive line, corner, linebacker, offensive line, somewhere that the veteran who can come in, contribute right away, and be a solid player for the Steelers, on top of adding at least one quarterback, maybe two quarterbacks through free agency. We've talked about Mason Rudolph being an option, Ryan Tannehill being an option. Both of those guys still very much on the table. But to even get to that point, you need to create some space, and these were some obvious cuts. Again, Chuks Okorafor was the one guy, I think, of these three that's probably the most disappointing in the fact that they're cut, because, not going into this year, everyone kind of knew who he was. But when he was drafted, he was looked at as a guy who was extremely young. He came into the NFL, I believe, at 20 years old. He was huge at 6'7", with the length that he had, with the potential to grow into that frame and become a more dominant player. And it just never happened. And they tried to move him to left tackle. It wouldn't work. They kept him at right tackle. He never developed a mean streak. And that was just not what the Steelers needed at that position. And when they put Broderick Jones in, it changed so much. So for a rookie to go in and take his place when they were thinking that the rookie would go in and take Dan Moore's place, that's truly disappointing. They had to move on from there. But that's what the Steelers need to find moving forward, is a player who can add to the offensive line sooner rather than later. I've been a big advocate for drafting a center early in the NFL draft, whether it's Jackson Powers Johnson out of Oregon or Zach Frazier out of West Virginia. Getting one of those guys either in the first or second round seems like a paramount objective for the Steelers front office. Now, getting a tackle, that could be tricky, because if you're doubling down the offensive line in the draft for guys that you want to be starters right away, you're probably spending your first and second round picks on that, which could mean that you're not adding a high pick to either your defense or a skill player position on offense. And that could be something that you don't want to do as much for the Steelers. You want to try to start getting younger with your star power on defense. And they did that a little bit last year with Keanu Benton and Joey Porter Jr. But there's going to be some challenges there for the Steelers for sure. And if you want to make it easy on yourself, you're going to want to be able to add a free agent who's going to help in that department, whether at tackle or on defense. I'll talk more about those options here after this quick break on this emergency episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. Again, we apologize for our dust here on the show. I'm on the road in an Airbnb, and we're dealing with some audio quality problems. So apologize if this does not come in as clear as all of our other shows, but please work with us here as we are trying to get you still the important talk. Now, I want to preface this by saying the full Tuesday episode that's going to come out at midnight will not cover what's been talked about here, because that episode was recorded before I hit the road for Virginia. In fact, before the Super Bowl even happened, because I wanted to get those out so I didn't have these problems recording my full episode. So apologies in advance for what happened there. When you listen to the full Tuesday episode, it will not have these points of information on it. But I want to get back to my point here and talking about what the Steelers need to come here. The future moves that still need to happen. If the Steelers are going to find a new center in the draft, it would make a lot of sense to either find a way to lessen Mason Cole's contract or just get rid of Mason Cole's contract, because I think he's a $6 million cap hit right now if you're the Steelers, and that is a lot of money to be giving to a guy who would be a backup offensive lineman at that point. And I think that you could look at Nate Herbig and say, hey, that's why you were brought in free agency. You could step in that position, or James Daniels could switch over to center because he's had some experience in doing that as well. But that's why I think the Steelers need to draft center so that they can afford to figure something else out there. But if they let go of Mason Cole, that's more money that they add to the pot there. And you could still look at other guys like, maybe Patrick Peterson, if you didn't want to pay his full $9+ million cap hit this upcoming season. You could try to look at other veterans who'd still be on the team. And again, you could still restructure some of their bigger contracts like Cam Hayward, like Minkah Fitzpatrick, like TJ Watt, move some of that money down the line and create the kind of cap space that you need to have more space to sign some bigger veterans. But these are all steps that need to come into play in the coming days if they're going to move other guys to be able to have that space. Now, free agency does not begin for another month. So the Steelers still have time to do this. And I think this is still just the early stages of, them getting ready for the combine, knowing what positions they want to focus on, who all they're going to talk to. And as they get into their draft process, which positions they're going to spend the most time researching, talking to, scouting, and building. But this is also, it's important to remember, a very different front office, because now, not only are the Steelers, new with Omar Khan as the head GM and Andy Weidel as the director of player personnel, but a lot of the scouts that were there that would help build the last era of Steelers with Kevin Colbert. They've also moved on, and the Steelers have found new guys there. So this is going to be a new regime as far as even some of the guys that were there last year were pieces and parts of the scouting department that aided Kevin Colbert for years. So now you're seeing a new group of people in recruiting, building the big boards and stacking the information. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how they set up the floor for those guys to operate. And part of that is also getting rid of some of the talent and the dead weight that you see on your roster right now to create space in the roster to go get guys in free agency. Also, how they use free agency. Last year they added a guy in Isaac Seumalo who proved really helpful. They made other additions like Keanu Neal who weren't as helpful. And it's going to be interesting to see what they prioritize, how they get guys in. And how they try to use them. At linebacker, I'd say that they found some pretty good guys. Cole Holcomb played well before he was knocked out for the season. Quan Alexander, I thought, played very well before he was knocked out for the season. Landon Roberts played very well all season long. And if they can hit on some more guys like that at different positions, that could help solidify them around their core pieces that have kind of built up their nucleus right now. But free agency, I don't think they need to make huge super splash signings like top of the class, but they need to make some solid veteran additions. And that's still going to require more cuts on top of Chuks, Okorafor, Pressley Harvin, and Mitch Trubisky, all three of the guys that they officially let go of on Monday. We'll keep you up to date with everything here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Again, I'm your host, Chris Carter. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. You can also listen to me or watch me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Again, we apologize for the audio quality here, but we wanted to get off an emergency episode here that was shorter to get you a quick reaction to those releases that we did see coming, but also preparing for you for what comes next. Just another quick reminder, again, the next episode, the full episode of Locked On Steelers, will not be talking about these cuts because it was recorded before they happened, even before the Super Bowl, because I knew I'd be on the road for work covering Pitt basketball. But we will try to have our Wednesday episode up with these new cuts and other moves being talked about here. Hopefully, we found some answers on the audio front here. But you all know, we very much value trying to get you the best kind of content here. So we hope that you work with us as we work through some of those technical issues. We will be back here on the Tuesday edition of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Stay tuned. We got a lot more coming you guys' way.